you very much for coming out. We really appreciate everyone coming for our third event of the week. Especially appreciate everyone who's been here for 3 evenings. I see a few folks that have been here for all 3 events, so really appreciate that. Also wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors, our Bitcoin sponsors, Aon, MHA Cayman, RSM OGO, and then Zedra, Cayman Enterprise City, and I forget our last sponsor, sorry, and Campbell Law, sorry about that. So really thank you to all of our sponsors. We really appreciate them supporting us, supporting the first ever Cayman Crypto Week. And then for all of you guys who came out tonight, I'm going to hand it over to our panel. I'm not going to try and introduce each of you guys. So can you guys please introduce yourselves? Carl, we can probably start with you, and then kick things off.
Hello. My name is Kyle. I am one of the co-founders of a company called Gitcoin. Gitcoin is in the Ethereum ecosystem that's really focused on grant making, capital allocation, and sovereign data of identity and reputation. So, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kyle. Hello, everyone. Jim Knox, Managing Director at Aon. I've helped a lot of companies here with their insurance needs, whether it's direct health insurance, cyber insurance, etc. Just want to share a little story or maybe an observation. I've been coming here for a number of years now. I love coming here, especially in New York, where I live in a house with 3 teenage girls. And typically when I come here, right outside my hotel about 2 in the morning, a rooster shows up and starts hollering. And I thought things changed here at Cayman, because I came here this week, been here all week, and it's been quiet. And man, I got some great sleep, right? And last night about 2:30, Mr. Rooster shows up right below my window. He starts hollering, 2:30, 4:30. I'm like, yeah, man, I'm back. Cayman's back. I'm back. So nice to meet you all.
Good evening, everybody. Great to see the turnout and so much interest in Cayman in a specific industry. For those who do not know me, my name is Aldo Barnard. I'm the blockchain and digital asset lead for RSM Cayman, covering Cayman, Bermuda, and BVI. I'm also a director in our insurance and asset management practice. We provide a range of services focused on audit and assurance, and consulting and other services in this industry. And as a firm, we are heavily and deeply invested in this industry, supporting the industry, our staff, and also expanding our capabilities to serve the ever-changing needs of our clients in this space that's really moving at breakneck speed on a daily basis.
Well, I know everyone came here tonight, and the title is Exploring Getting into DAOs, but I know a lot of people have probably heard the word DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, but they're not quite clear exactly what a DAO is. And I think a lot of people have different interpretations about what a DAO actually is. So I thought I'd kick it off asking all 3 panelists, in your opinion, if you had to describe it to someone, what is a DAO? Do you want to go first?
I'll go first, and I'm going to put my attorney hat on. So, if you happen to be in California, and 2 or 3 or 4 or more people get together to form an enterprise, let's call it a DAO, and the purpose of that enterprise is to drive a profit. Under California law, by default, you're automatically a general partnership, a DAO, right? Just what I find fascinating, because you can be in California, create a DAO, you do not organize this as a general partnership, you can register with the state, but because of the activities you engage in, you are now considered a general partnership. And along with general partnership comes some laws that affect your liability, meaning under general partnership theory or law, every single member of that DAO is personally liable, jointly and severally, right? So my interpretation of a DAO with a legal interpretation is in California, for better or worse, it's a general partnership.
Oh man. All right. I'm afraid to join one now and be part of it. My goodness. So I would anchor that a DAO is any sort of shared or common interest. There have been a number of very successful DAOs that have erupted around artwork, around the Constitution, around software and protocols, and whatever that might be. But it usually takes some sort of common bond, common interest, an outcome that you want to see collectively happen. And you can have folks contribute and participate in a number of ways to drive to that collective outcome. watch your liabilities, it sounds like, as well.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, it's a great description, James. I would say, in simple terms, it's a community that's formed for a specific purpose or a vision to achieve a certain goal. And part of that also evolves around using technology in a way that the technology eventually will sort of operate on its own and make decisions. So you have sort of a decision-making process that is automated in a way, but set to a certain culture or vision of that community.
Well, I think you guys, you do a very good coverage. I always look at it as the next iteration of democracy, how people work together. We've done towns, we've done cities, then states, countries, companies eventually, and now we've got the next iteration of actually working together. I'd like to almost go through the life cycle of a DAO, because you guys work with it day to day. Kyle, you actually started up a DAO, and you guys ran the Gitcoin DAO. How did you guys get that idea? How was it to actually start a DAO up? And what are some of the challenges that people probably don't think about?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give just a little bit of context on what Gitcoin is for those of you that don't know. Gitcoin started as a Delaware C Corp organization. We were based inside of the United States. And we launched a particular product and protocol focused on grant making using a novel funding mechanism called quadratic funding. In this particular case, that's one of the most democratic ways to allocate capital. And myself and my co-founder was poised with lots of different questions on who should be eligible for this money? How much money should we allocate to what types of projects? And we quickly realized that we ourselves didn't want to be kingmakers. We didn't want to be the ones deciding between he and I how much capital to allocate in what particular place. And so that's one of the beauties of having a tokenized environment, was that there's some form of ownership in the community and decision making. So full circle back to the question of what is a DAO, those that are a part of or contribute to Gitcoin are very much interested in funding public goods, funding open source software, climate activation, DE&I rounds, perhaps just Ethereum infrastructure software, whatever that might be. So there's communities that have sort of popped up to use Gitcoin's technology to go through and allocate capital. In our case, we recognized that we wanted to make those decisions as to how much capital and whom and under what eligibility criteria should be turned back to the community itself. So there's almost always some sort of genesis event. Sometimes that genesis event is someone puts up a PFP. Nouns is a good example inside of the Ethereum ecosystem. You have to buy this particular digital asset to be a part of that DAO, and it gives you voting rights. But however members get into your particular voting organization, that particular catalyst kicks off the DAO, and usually there's some form of treasury that's formed, there's some form of decision-making around how to allocate the capital from the treasury and move forward. In Gitcoin's case, we've seen a number of iterations. I think we started out as, like I mentioned, a Delaware C Corp, and then launched the network in the DAO almost 2.5, nearly 3 years after the organization was around. And so we had a very large following, a very interested community that was able to participate, and now really leads and guides much of that decision making, which was always the goal. But it's taken us a number of iterations to get to that point, and I think a number of DAOs are starting to figure out like what works and how much responsibility you can delegate to someone with low context, and how much you can't, and what types of things you should delegate in that order too.
What happened to the C Corp?
What happened to the C Corp? So I will go much deeper after the evening. I think the short version is the C Corp still exists and is very much focused on the for-profit work that Gitcoin was doing. And the DAO and the foundation that I lead right now is very much focused on the capital allocation, the grant making, and the non-profit work that Gitcoin was doing. Gitcoin had a bounties board and Git hackathons and all sorts of other things, services to help other ecosystems grow. And so we sort of split the organization at that time, and I went with the philanthropic work, and Kevin went with, my co-founder went with the business focus areas.
I think that's a very good overview. So Kyle sort of explained to us how you get started, you get community, everyone starts working together. Jim, you work in the insurance space. And I think a lot of people are sort of concerned with, can you manage your risk? Can you get insurance in this space? If you're a token holder, director, whoever you might be, what does the insurance space look like at the moment for DAOs?
Sure. So I would say the good news is I'm not aware of any litigation against any Cayman-based foundation so far to date. I think, Aldo, we talked yesterday or the day before where possibly a company associated with the Cayman-based foundation that was doing a token issuance in the States was chased by the SEC. Right? Not a great shot there. So the good news is I'm not aware of any litigation to date against the Cayman Foundation. So there is, but there's still a demand for the DNO or Directors of Health Insurance Foundations. And to me, like my mind is right now, it's pretty much like a check the box, right? Like if you're setting up a foundation here, very often, it's a check the box exercise where we're going to, buy a minimum amount of DNO insurance. Frankly, you don't need a lot because it's such a low litigation environment. And then they put it in place, sleep insurance. And some companies decide, you know what, we're comfortable without it. We don't need it. I will say 3-4 years ago, it was very difficult to get direct health insurance for a Cayman-based foundation. In the last couple of years, there's been some new entrants into the marketplace, some in Bermuda, some in London, one in the US, and they're now offering pretty aggressive terms for DNO insurance. And just one quick story. I was invited here for the first time to Cayman a couple of years ago. Ali Bell invited me. We had a panel at KPMG. You might have been there for that. And for a brief moment in time, I felt like a rock star. Less than 5 minutes. I sat on the panel. We talked about various topics, and then I mentioned, oh yeah, we can put in place DNO insurance for you guys. And I was mobbed by about 15 people after the chat because people said we can't get it. How do you get that? So like 5 minutes, I felt like a rock star. I went back home with my 3 teenage daughters and let me know, no, Dad, you're not a rock star. I didn't close. But that was my moment in the sunshine for a brief period.
I mean, I think as long as you solve people's problems, you'll definitely be a rock star in their eyes. So for a few people, definitely so. Although you deal with the very practical side of actually accounting for digital assets, I think in a lot of the DAOs, we see books and records being made. And there are challenges that I think a lot of people don't realize that there are. Another thing that we're starting to see in some of the DAOs is they're doing transparency reports, where they'll actually report on their financials. It's almost very similar to what you see with the annual report from some large companies. What are some of the challenges and what are you seeing in the space that sort of from the accounting and auditing side is developing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Question for you is how long do we have to cover this? So, I mean, briefly, I won't sort of bore you with all the details, and we'll try and sort of just high level cover the key areas to look at, specifically in the DAO space. The first thing I would say is sort of deciding on, for those DAOs that's decided upon having an audit or mandating an audit, because it's not sort of mandatory at this point, but we do see a lot that does sort of engage auditors for good corporate governance and various other reasons. But actually, untraditionally, accounting framework. Okay, so US GAAP, IFRS, most of us in this room is familiar with that, so let's ignore the others. So, why is that? Typically, we've seen, in the funds industry, if the investor base management is mostly domiciled in the US, they would go with US GAAP, rest of the world IFRS. We moved into the funds sort of specific on crypto. There was sort of the funds were inclined to move towards US GAAP more so than IFRS because there was more clear guidance, specific industry guidance for the fund industry. So when you get to the DAO space, there's no sort of specialized industry guidance. So why is this accounting framework decision so important? Well, it depends on the vision and sort of the mission of the DAO and where they see this project going into the future. And what I mean by that is, a big component of the DAOs is you're looking at IP, right? There's intellectual property, there's a platform that's being developed, a protocol, a technology stack. IFRS, granted you go through all the steps and you meet all the criteria, allows internally developed intangible assets to potentially be capitalized, right? Research you have to write off. And the US GAAP, it's near impossible to get there. So it's a really key decision on how you want your balance sheet to look like going forward. That's really why I'm bringing that point up. Moving away from the accounting framework, there's a lot we can go through, but I think the key things are a lot of the DAOs through one of the entities in the structure, whether it's the foundation, which we see most of the times, the issuance of a SAFT, raising funds. I'll just stick to the SAFT issuance. When do I recognize revenue, right? Is it out the gates? And the long short of it is, there's other things to consider as well as performance obligations. Now, when we look at performance obligations in a SAFT, so just raise your hands how many people in this room has briefly looked at a SAFT agreement. Okay, I think you'll all agree, especially the earlier SAFT agreements, when we look for performance obligations in that agreement, they're non-existent to at best minimal. So it becomes very difficult to determine at what point to recognize the revenue. I would say typically there's sort of an implied performance obligation if there's nothing really there that's concrete. That is the delivery of the token. So it's kind of towards the end of the project. So that's something that we've seen a lot of debate and discussion and different treatment about. The next step would be token issuance, because if you raise money, you're probably going to issue a token at some point. So if I just mint for sort of non-proof of work chains, proof of stake, Ethereum, and all the others, if I just mint a bunch of tokens and I decide to apply a value of $1 to it, does that mean if I pre-minted $1 million tokens, I have $1 million somewhere on my balance sheet? No. So the way I try and explain this in a simple way to people is, think of the traditional world where you look at authorized versus issued share capital. You would never recognize authorized capital, right? It's similar to a gift card as well. Starbucks has millions of gift cards that they create, but they would not recognize or think about recognizing revenue until such time as a customer actually walks through the door and buys a gift card and puts money on it, and then you start thinking about the performance obligations. So that's something to think about. The other thing that we see a lot that the DAOs are heavily involved in, obviously, is really managing the treasury. So there's a lot of assets, and obviously they want to try and generate yield. So staking, yield farming, and all of that comes to light. Comes to mind. Staking revenue, again, the revenue recognition, performance obligations. Not going to go into the detail, but you really need to look carefully through the smart contract, if it's protocol staking, the service provider that you're working with, principal versus agent considerations, to understand at what point should you recognize revenue. Is it block by block? Is it hour by hour? Day by day? Monthly? And that's really determined in, again, analyzing the smart contract, analyzing the agreement that you look at, and focusing on the performance obligations. There's a ton of stuff, so we're not going to keep you busy all night. That's sort of a good summary.
Well, I appreciate it. I think it's really interesting to see where people with your experience of traditional audit firms are coming and working with foundations and DAOs to give that transparency to communities, because I think a lot of the time the community is sort of wondering what's going on, and that experience is then something that they can rely on and sort of builds that trust. Kyle, I want to almost throw it over to you next. You've operated a DAO, and a DAO is very different than any other company. It's very sort of unstructured sometimes. People are all over the world. They're using different tools through multi-sigs. You guys have working groups, etc. What are some of the challenges in actually operating a DAO and making sure things happen inside a DAO?
Yeah, good question. So whenever the Gitcoin DAO launched, we had this sort of Cambrian explosion of ideas and people showing up. And at the time, these are your community. Like, these are people who care about the things that you care about. And so the first person that walked in the door that was wearing a blue hat, it was like, welcome, you're our chief of police. And the next guy who walked in was wearing a red hat. It's like, you're going to be the head of fire. Like, you'll put out fires for us. And the next person who came, we started assigning roles to different people without any sort of diligence on what experience do you have, what are you interested in doing. Like, there's so much that folks, I think, we have learned from a business setting that DAOs are like, oh, we don't need to interview people. They got great vibes. Don't worry. Like, I hung with them at this conference, like, they're amazing. And it's like, what do they do? I don't even know. We get to talk about it. We just need to hire them. Great. How much? They need to make $200K, though. The vibes are going to be great. Trust me. $200K, just pay that person. there is so much that we have learned on how to make sure we're doing due diligence on what we want and need. So more formal RFP process, putting things out to the community members to then try and showcase what they're capable of. Instead of us just very quickly assigning, yeah, policeman, you're vibes man now too, okay? Like clearly you didn't know anything about being a police, but I hear you got great vibes, go spread the vibes for our community. And policemen got paid $200K. Vibes people get paid like 60 to 80K USD though. Okay, if that doesn't work, then we'll find another vibes person. We had to do a lot of restructuring on contributors, a lot of restructuring on what we call work streams, just those that are participating in like a coordinated fashion. But I think when we initially launched the DAO, we had dreamed of 5 particular work streams. We had very specific needs that we wanted to turn over to the community: decision-making, grant side, anti-fraud, a bunch of other things. And what we've learned is that a stacked vertical with smaller teams actually offers a lot more accountability and autonomy. They can run faster, they can pick their own teams, they can decide how to compensate one another, and it's not up to just the collective consensus on vibes person gets 200K, but like that other person gets 50K, or that other person over there. So we've had to just sort of level up a lot of folks that are new to best business practices and how to accomplish a particular outcome. But it has been incredibly messy over the last nearly 3 years. And it usually takes quite a number of people, 10-ish, very, very dedicated behind the scenes, propping things up for a number of time until you can find the right community members, find the right approach that works for those that are interested in the same things that you hope to accomplish.
I think that's what's been interesting is we have an idea of a DAO, everyone's going to work together, we still need someone who's going to actually do the work. And those people need to be the right people to do the work. So it's very interesting to see how some of the lessons from traditional companies we apply here, giving people responsibilities, accountability. Jim, I want to hand over to you next. We have seen some litigation in the space. We've had the Ookie DAO case, we've had Lido recently. You used to actually work in the litigation side of things. What do you think about litigation that has happened to date? What's interesting about that, and what do you see potentially in the future in that area?
Thanks, Petri. So I guess because I'm the insurance guy, I always talk about the dark side of things. It's that we're going, yeah, great. Is this being recorded, by the way?
You're managing the risk, so we want to know what those risks are.
This is being recorded, yes. All right, so I'll be a little bit circumspect in what I say. So again, putting my attorney hat on, what I find fascinating about DAOs is how in the US is absolutely pushing the envelope of our entire legal framework, meaning the following. So if you look at Ookie DAO, right? The first time I'm aware of that, if you're going to sue somebody, if there's going to be enforcement action by a regulator, you have to serve what's called proper notice, okay, on that party, let them officially know they're being sued, all right, or enforcement action. And there's certain rules on how you do this, right? You just can't write a summons on a piece of paper, make it to fold into an airplane, shoot through a window, right? You can't. There's certain ways you have to effect what's called notice. And the challenge with Ookie DAO is that there's no one to serve. They couldn't find anybody with this DAO. There's some people running around the states, but no one can find them. There's no legal entity. You can't knock on a door, the Ookie DAO door, their corporate office. So what they did there was, some of you may be familiar with this, the CFTC, the regulator, went into the Ookie DAO chat box, help chat box, and said, oh, hey, by the way, you're being sued. Here's an enforcement action. And the court upheld that, right? I mean, it's the first time it ever happened where notice was given by going on someone's help box, chat box, on the website. So that happened, right? And then that was Ookie DAO. And not surprised that Ookie DAO, the suit was in Northern California, which frankly seems like all the DAO suits in the States are now going to Northern California, San Francisco, because of that general partnership law I talked about earlier. So in the most recent case, Lido, the Lido token, kind of like the common allegations there. It was a security, you should register security. It's being traded on Coinbase, California Exchange, which gave jurisdiction over the case. What was interesting in Lido was, again, they used general partnership theory, right, by default. California, again, as I said before, the mere fact that you're operating like a general partnership, by default, you are one, okay? Which is why a lot of these suits are brought in, these DAO suits are brought in California. But in Lido, what was very interesting was how these DAO suits are evolving. Now the plaintiffs bar, the plaintiffs are waking up and saying, whoa, we may get some money for this DAO, but we're going after the deep pockets now. So in the Lighthouse case, they went after Andreessen Horowitz, VC investor, went after Dragonfly. First time in a DAO suit, they're bringing in now investors, right? And that's interesting because you have to say to yourself, we want to see this industry thrive, right, and scale, really do well. But if investors now are afraid to start getting involved, and start putting money in and supporting these DAOs, will it ever reach its full potential? And that's something that I know with the Lighthouse case is very interesting. Will it be a chilling effect on VCs now? And investors say, well, I'm not getting involved in this. Remember I said before, the token members of a DAO are jointly so liable. So what's interesting in a DAO litigation, I think it was Zuki DAO, there's one called, it was B2K or B2Z. In that case, the B2Z, the DAO, the token members themselves sued the other token holders, token members, because they failed to install adequate security measures to prevent a hack. It was like 1.7 million stolen. But what's interesting was that the plaintiffs in that case, who were token holders of this DAO, if the ultimate result is that they're held separately and jointly responsible, the plaintiffs themselves who brought the suit, they can be held liable for paying out. It's just, so this whole DAO concept is blowing the minds of the legal framework in America, to put it inarticulately.
I think that's the really interesting thing here, is not just in the legal side and the accounting side, and a lot of other places, it's forcing us to rethink things and really innovate, which hasn't happened for a while.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of a DAO, right? I mean, it's a concept, it's very conceptual, and it's really pushing the envelope of legal framework in the States. And I think it's fascinating because you're going to have to think outside the box now. This is the world we're in, right? For a legal framework, you have to start thinking outside the box as technology, how it's evolving, and how we're going to handle it.
Aldo, I'm going to hand over to you next. I think one of the things we're seeing is a lot of DAOs are actually these days set up on very large treasuries. And I think last year we saw with quite a few of the digital asset firms that risk management in the industry wasn't great. So in terms of treasuries and DAOs, what are some of the things that we can learn from traditional finance potentially and some of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think sort of on the treasuries, some very sort of interesting phenomena that we've seen is, DAOs have their own tokens. They typically have a large holding in those tokens for obvious reasons, because you would want to demonstrate you have faith in your own token and governance. But sort of the sound rules around corporate governance or treasury management, for that matter, would be that you diversify. So you're on a bit of a trickery slope, because once you start selling your tokens, and with the blockchain, a lot of things are transparent and easy to identify which wallets belongs to a potential DAO. Once the industry sort of picks up that this wallet is dumping, that's perceived generally out the gates as bad news, and you may end up crashing your own project with the value going down. So there's a really sort of delicate balance that these projects deal with in terms of how do I manage my treasury in terms of risk management and exposure, not being exposed only to my token, but also how do I ensure that I do sell off some of my holdings in my token for the not so good times, right? We all know we go through this 4-year cycles, and you really have to have a good stomach in crypto, because you're going to experience a massive hyperbolic run up, and then you're going to have a 95% drawdown on any given day or week on an alt. So you have to prepare for that. In the 2018, 2019, 2017 cycle, the ICO grades, and then after that the SAFs, a lot of projects has gone bust exactly because of that reason, right? They sort of just held on to their tokens, they were millionaires, and the next day they woke up and they were broke, and no more project, right? So that's important. On the risk management, I think a lot, and this is not something new, key management. So when you have self-custody of the assets, which I believe a lot of these projects probably will do, because again, it demonstrates faith in the DeFi space rather than banking with the traditional banks. It's really important to manage that whole sort of the key ceremony, setting up your wallets, using multi-sig or other means to really secure the assets and have controls around who can access it, levels of approval, different signatures, and that whole framework. But sort of the usual suspects I would cover from traditional.
No, that's a very valid point, because I think people are more aware of that now. It is a cycle. The token is just going to infinitely go up.
So it's good to see people starting to realize that you need to plan if you want there to be longevity in your project. Kyle, I'm going to throw it over to you next. I don't want Jim to be the only one talking about negative things. So
Thank you.
in terms of DAOs generally, not Gitcoin specifically, what have you seen going wrong in sort of DAOs in the last while? And what do you think are some of the challenges going forward?
I suspect there's a lot of those banner headlines on such and such DAO gets rugged. There's plenty of dysfunction across organizations as well, where they haven't quite figured out that contributor, like how to unlock and continue to advance things. Some of the places that have been the most interesting and largely least talked about are the projects where they have an incredible treasury and they stop shipping anything. Like they sort of stop adding value for the community. One example of this is the Gitcoin Foundation, actually. Golem had this huge ICO. They have thousands and thousands of ETH in their treasury, and they have really struggled to get any sort of adoption on their programs, technology, things like that. And it's like so disheartening to see in the space that like not only were they right time, they absolutely had the right products, they were funded beyond what they could imagine, and like there still was a failure of that particular organization to capitalize on that. So it just like in most sort of VC, Web 2, like any type of capital markets, it really takes the special sauce of the right team, the right time, the right market, and like the right problem you're trying to pursue. And despite crypto, the economics that are made available, it's not always solved with just 3 out of those 4. A couple of the other places I think are always PFP projects. I think there's a lot of hype around community engagements with different NFTs and things. Seeing what they do with the artwork, how they continue to pull people together is fascinating. I am most familiar with the Ethereum ecosystem, so if you are much deeper in other ecosystems, I apologize for not talking about your project or your ecosystem itself. But I think a lot of the social DAOs also had a really hard time over this last bear market. Close with folks at FWE. FWE is probably one of the most banner success stories, I would say, as of 2 years ago. They have been having to reboot quite a lot to figure out like what purpose they have in the space outside of just curating vibes, or if they can charge for curating vibes. They're actually doing a fantastic job of trying to reboot and offer like professional services around we'll help curate your community vibes. They're partnering with folks that have sort of bad reputations in the space, and they're trying to help them rebuild their reputation and rebuild their legitimacy. So across each of the spectrum, I think most folks are trying to figure out what type of financial longevity model they have. To the exact point that Aldo had is, when tokens go down, vibes aren't enough to sustain people's rent or their power bill, or if they're feeding kiddos, for example. So in those situations, I think that's when folks are coming back to kind of core principles on how we're going to sustain ourselves, what really is our community and sort of purpose for what we're doing. And any number of projects have failed for all sorts of reasons. But I think we've heard about some of the larger rugs, whether that's institutional funds or things like that, which always hurt the market. But it's a lot of these stories as a founder that like I'll see and talk to other founders, and the new mayor of FWB, Greg and I are very close. Just hearing the trials and tribulations of all these other organizations that don't have sound financial models, that haven't considered what's next for them once they solve a particular problem or bring people together. It's just, like I said, it's hard. It's hard in those founder circles when you're all sort of crying on each other's shoulders, and it's like, but you had it all. And they're like, I know, and I lost it on red. And I was like, okay. So how do we help them move forward a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, especially I think a lot of people identify that problem that they're solving, but they don't see the roadmap, so they don't know where are we heading with that. Jim, I would be amiss if I didn't ask you, because on all of our previous panels this week, we've had a question about the US regulatory environment. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I think the Cayman market has benefited because of some of that uncertainty. What are you seeing at the moment? Where do you think we're heading with the US regulatory environment as it relates to DAOs?
I get the easy questions, don't I?
Definitely.
Yes. Okay, so This is being recorded, so I'm going to be somewhat circumspect because I want to go back to the States and not get arrested. So I'll just put this out flatly, right? Gary Gensler, SEC chair, gets a lot of bad press, this whole regulation by enforcement thing. My viewpoint might be a bit Jonas because I was a former prosecutor and I'm a big believer in enforcement. So the issue we have in the States is that we don't have our MiCA laws, right? So Gensler is working, the SEC and the CFTC, they're working with the laws we have right now. And the law that defines what it's a security is this thing called the Howey test, the U.S. Supreme Court, right? The highest court in the land. I think it's like 70 years old, right? There's been no development since then. Like we talked about the DAOs before, how the DAOs are pushing the legal framework. We haven't caught up. So I wrote some things down before. I'll just read to you very quickly, give you an idea of what we're missing in the U.S. So you've got these MiCA laws in Europe, and they come into effect December 30th of 2024 this year. Some are coming into effect in June, right? So this is what MiCA has done in Europe, which to me gives people in the space, in the digital asset space, it gives them guidelines, it gives them guardrails on which to work. MiCA defines what a digital asset is. MiCA defines what digital assets fall under its own jurisdiction. A couple of things here I think are really important. MiCA defines who has authority to regulate and enforce legislation with digital assets. So you don't have like we have in the US right now, the CFTC and the SEC both coming together, beating up people at the same time. It's overkill. Clarifies the regulatory obligations applicable to issuers of asset-based tokens, what their obligations are, right? MiCA completely outlaws algorithmic stablecoins, right? We don't have that in the US. Because we don't have that in the US, you had the whole Terra Luna disaster happen, right? People lost a lot of money by use of this algorithmic stablecoin. So the regulatory environment right now, they're going to do what they're going to do. They're going to work with the laws that we have in place right now. So, some people see there's overreach, Gensler lost on the Grayscale, he lost on Ripple, but he's won on a lot of others, right? FTX set us back years in the US, right? So we need our MiCA moment. We need the US legislature, the Senate, Congress to step up and say, here are some guidelines to give you people some help knowing how to conduct yourselves in this industry, right? We don't have that, and that's causing a lot of problems.
The certainty and the guidance that can help a lot. I think that's what we've seen in Canada. We've had laws in place for a while, and people like that certainty that at least know where they stand.
Well, the net effect is, if any of you attended the event last night, you had a woman from Avalanche, right? One of my clients, she said, one of my other clients, Avalanche, they're doing everything they can now to remove themselves from U.S. territory, U.S. jurisdiction. That's the net effect. The net effect is that people are fleeing the U.S. because they're not sure how to operate. If one morning they're going to wake up on the chat box, they're going to get a nice letter from the CFTC saying, hey, you're being sued. That's the issue we have right now. So, I think there is movement in the U.S. to have this change over time. There's movement for the legislation to start moving ahead. So, we'll see what happens. But the issue right now is we don't have our MiCA moment. We don't have these guidelines. The last thing I'll say about MiCA, though, is an interesting observation. A lot of my clients, they're even moving totally offshore right now in the U.S., or maybe some of the divisions are, the subsidiaries. But the interesting thing I'm noticing is they're not going to Europe. They're going to Singapore, they're going to Dubai. So I'm saying to myself, are they not going to Europe because there's more regulation? There is regulation there. Like, what's going on, guys? So I haven't figured out yet, but just an observation.
I'm sure some of them are coming to Cayman as well.
And Cayman.
So,
yes.
Ollie, I'll throw that one over to you. I know you guys work with some of the banks on islands that are fully licensed. You're working with some other entities that are based in Cayman. What are you seeing in terms of entities moving to Cayman and people actually physically coming to Cayman to live down here?
Yes, good question. I was sort of hoping I would get back after Jim's comments and the regulations. So, big round of applause to the SEC and Gary Gensler because they're sending a lot of business Cayman stuff. So keep on doing that. And that's a benefit. I think as an island, we've done great work with the Cayman Enterprise City, the Special Economic Zone. There's a lot of projects that sort of either headquartered or has operations out of there. We've seen a lot of interest from projects out of the US that just says exactly that they have no interest in continuing in the US because there's no regulatory clarity, and that's a different environment to do business, right? That's almost like the volatility in the market over a 4-year cycle. You just don't know where you're going to end up unless you manage that risk. So there's a big movement, a lot of sort of discussions with the enterprise city, the economic zone. There's some of the biggest names, the brightest minds are on island, actually living and working here. And then that's a great sign. I think from an island perspective, that's fantastic news. That puts us on the map. We've got a great sort of reputation on the fund side, and it kind of makes logical sense for us to be involved in this. And it's really the challenge now is just from a governance and a reputation and sustainability perspective, ensuring that we attract the right projects, that we try and avoid. It's not always possible, but an FTX-like situation, which we won't really have because we don't see a lot of that on island, sort of exchange stuff. Projects, it's more sort of the DAOs, foundations, operational companies. So yeah, I mean, like I said, great work from the US, sending a lot of business Cayman's direction. That gives us a lot of opportunity going forward, because we don't want to leave it too late and not be there. I think if you're going to be a last mover in this space, you would have missed out. So it's great to see that we're up with the likes of the Dubais and the Singapores, being there, welcoming these projects. And they have a bit of a sandbox environment that they can operate in, so that gives them flexibility.
I think that clarity definitely helps. And it's very nice to see sort of a community starting to be built in Cayman, lots of interesting folks coming down. Carl, I want to almost start wrapping up with you. You guys have now almost gone through the life cycle of DAO. You recently published the Gitcoin and Executive, sort of what you guys are planning, what you see in the future. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are working on, sort of what the next steps are for Gitcoin?
Yeah, sure. So in chess, the game of chess, there's usually 3 stages of the game. The beginning, the mid-game, and then the end game. And the intermediate user, player, almost always enjoys the mid-game the most, and you find the end game the hardest. The mid-game is usually much faster paced, you get to take pieces, your pieces are taken, and the beginning game is often very formulaic, you don't know how to set up your chessboard. The end game is really what matters the most, and it's the hardest to sort of overcome. So, in a nod to the chess game itself, we've been talking about Gitcoin's end game. And I feel like we've gone through a lot of the very messy taking pieces, people taking our pieces, the buy and demand, like all those situations. And now we're hopefully structured in a way that we think we can sort of get much closer to our big, hairy, audacious goal. In this particular case, the end game post that we talked about is sort of restructuring much of our organization, moving a lot of the technology teams to own almost as like a business unit. They have full stack ownership and accountability across a couple of the outcomes that we care about. And our community has really flourished and it's aligned on funding public goods in particular, but just capital allocation and helping other ecosystems grow and allocate capital. So throughout this particular iteration, some of the things that have been important is making sure that decision-making is still highly decentralized. We want to make sure that capital allocation is determined by the community, but then our own capital. Gitcoin has 2 treasuries, one of which is to fund other projects and one is to fund our particular project. Make sure that there's good checks and balances across both of those treasuries as well. But I think the end game is a piece that we feel like protocol is live, the teams are productive, there's revenue coming in, we actually have a business model, like there's so much of sort of lining up that now we can structure the teams and the people and sort of set a process vision. We're hoping that we'll be successful and be able to ride both this wave coming up as well as the next few that might be dipping afterwards.
That's very exciting, and it's very cool to see sort of you guys developing the business units, actually maturing everything. I know we don't have too much time left. We would love to get some questions from the audience. Is there anyone who has any specific questions?
Hi. I wanted to ask a question to Kyle, which is, in my studies of economics, public goods has a very specific kind of definition, and I wanted to know, the other night when we had the women in the blockchain event, terminology is really important, and that you don't get like wedded into terms that might betray us later on. So does it mean the same thing as in economics? And could you maybe just describe a few of the projects that you're interested in and working on? And then I wanted to sort of reflect on that question too, because is there an insurance part of that question too. Like where Jim might have something to weigh in on. Like if we're creating a public good and we're trying to make something that benefits a great big set of people, does one need to consider the liability and insurance and future legal implications, whether or not we know what those are?
Sure, yeah, I'll take the first and definitely defer the second. So for those of you who don't know, public goods is a very esoteric economic term that talks about goods that are non-rivalrous and non-competitive. Clean air is a public good. True open source software is a public good. Me consuming it does not stop you from consuming it or being able to advance and build a business on it, or perhaps breathe yourself and continue to live. In Gitcoin's case, this is exactly why we moved to a community. I had a very sort of die on this hill, that project is not a public good. And one example of that was inside of a lot of the Ethereum ecosystem at the events, there's a particular DAO called Pizza DAO. Pizza DAO receives funding from different places, and they go through and they buy 30, 40 pizzas, and then they give that out to people at the particular event. They feel like it's a public good. And I'm like, no, it's clearly competitive, and it's clearly right, like you consume the thing, like how could this be a public good? And so what happened was they appealed whenever they got denied because they wanted to receive funding on our particular platform. And I was like, there was a small group of us that were reviewing eligibility criteria. I was like, no, like you're eating the pizza, like you can't give this out. Like, how is this a public good? And so they were like, well, what's your appeal process? We want to appeal. And I was like, take it to the governance forums, let's go. And they sure enough did. We put it to a vote, and the community voted that Pizza DAO was a public good and that they should receive funding. The vast majority of those who showed up were also in the Ethereum ecosystem and very much appreciated free pizza at all of the events they went to. So there was a little bit of quid pro quo happening there, and we let it slide. But what was fascinating was like that to me was our governance working, but it very much sort of skewed what we call a public good these days. So second part of your question, projects that I'm interested in. I am a nerd at heart. I love a lot of the ZK projects, things that are happening around account abstraction. I was super deep with some of the DeFi folks on just like bonding curve models and things like that as well that they've been putting into place on lending models. But generally speaking, I think a lot of the identity and reputation space, particularly around account abstraction and what's possible with wallets and like how do you represent yourself in a place where you don't have to share your name or your picture or your identity, but still be trustworthy. Right now, in almost all of crypto, you have to have over-collateralized loans, which doesn't actually help those who need the funding. Like it helps those that have the funding themselves, but like want to get a cheaper interest rate, a higher yield somewhere else with their own money. So figuring out those types of problems are really interesting to me. I love seeing just like entrepreneurism flourish a bit more. And then to the risk side and how to ensure that.
Well, I actually have a question for you, Kyle. Was that pizza token registered as security? Because it was a promise to return, right? Pizza. So did you do the right thing? We will save that in your report. The insurance question is very easy. Whatever activity you engage in, whatever it is there inherent risk with it, right? And once you identify that risk, you want to transfer it to an insurance product. So, if you're issuing tokens, yeah, got some risk, right? So it really depends on the activity you engage in, and if you've done a good analysis of the risk associated, how you want to address it.
Thank you. Thanks for a good panel. My question is, the foundation company that we have in Cayman has been a very useful vehicle for assisting with the DAOs, and it's been a successful story for the last few years. What are the risks you see, both locally here of the environment changing, regulation changing, that could affect that present situation, or do you see any other jurisdiction or any other legal entity that could take this business away from Cayman?
I would defer to Aldo on that one, the local guy.
Well, on the foundations, I mean, definitely there's risk, like we've just heard. Some of the cases that Jim explain. And it's really about managing or limiting that risk. I know in Wyoming, they've got like an LLC type structure, which, you know, rumor has it that is a type of product that competes with Cayman. But at this point in time, given, again, going back to the regulatory uncertainty in the US and nobody really knowing where to go, what to do, how to position their business, I wouldn't necessarily see existential risk for us, Cayman, losing business to the US for quite some time. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we're in a space that's very dynamic, that's very entrepreneurial, and I'm sure somebody is going to come up with a product or a structure that might very well compete with the Cayman Foundation setup. It may most likely come out of the Middle East. I thought it would be Singapore because they like very close-knit and regulating and sort of trying to keep a handle on everything. So yeah, I mean, for now, I think the foundation has been tried and tested. That usually sort of first mover advantage, again, counts in our advantage. But you know, like any business, it does come with risk, which you can't avoid.
Anyone else? Perfect. We don't have any other questions.
I think we can wrap things up. Well, I think firstly, thank you very much to our panelists. Really appreciate you guys coming out. Really enjoyed the conversation. And then thank you very much for everyone else who came out. We have drinks on the side. Please join us afterwards. Socialize so you can meet everyone. I mean, panelists will be around.
Can I just ask a general question here? How many people here, hands up, are participating in the pickleball tournament? All right. Keep your hands up if you played pickleball before. Okay. I've never played.
Well, we've got a trophy, so I mean, we've got a trophy that we're going to exchange every year. So
I think Jim's assessing the risk. So it's
Yes, I like what I see. Yes.
Cool. I think the last thing is just for everyone that's here, we have new changes to the VASP law in Cayman that have been issued, and they're out for commentary at the moment. In the first for me that I've seen that Cayman has done, it is up on GitHub, where people can actually on GitHub comment on it and put in any comments internationally. So for everyone here in the room, if you're so inclined, please go have a look at those changes. Please comment, interact with it. I think it'll be very exciting if people can interact with it, more people can be aware of it, and it's actually a very collaborative way to do it. So please go have a look at that and interact. Thank you very much to everyone, and we'll see you for some drinks.